Thank you guys for joining. I appreciate you all being here and coming to listen to me for an hour. Hopefully you won't be super tired of my voice at the end of it. We're going to talk a little bit more about BIML. I'm not going to say much more than what Mikhail already said, but to dumb it all down, I help people make sense of their data. Got my own company called 2812 Consulting. Have a blog. I am on Twitter, and all of the stuff that we're going to talk about today will be on or in my GitHub repo before the end of the day if you guys want to see. We'll come back to the slide at the end, so don't worry about that too much. So in terms of the agenda, there's a few things we're going to talk about today. Mainly what I do want to chat about is really the following points. First, we're going to chat a little bit about what BIML is. And then we'll look at, reasons to use BIML, because, why should we just use something for the sake of using it? Then we'll cover some BIML basics. And then ultimately, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about how I use BIML. And as you can imagine, this session is really about my journey into the world of BIML and how I became or came to use it. I wasn't an early adopter like some of the other folks. I waited quite a while, and hopefully the lessons I learned and sort of the journey I had in getting to the point of using it would help you guys, make good decisions about whether you think it's a good fit for you or not. And so with that being said, you may look like this little guy and say, what and who is BIML? So if I may ask at this point, I want to get an idea of how you guys feel about BIML. And I'm not sure if Mikhail got the poll up there, but if you didn't, oh, there it is. I see it. If you could answer the poll there so we can get an idea of, what your experience is with BIML, if you don't mind. And then Mikhail will let me know what the results are. Give you a second or two for that. We seeing anything there yet, Mikhail?
We have a majority of none. With a strong second on the medium level, some experience. So we have more people with none experience than combined a little and some experience.
All right, excellent.
An expert, and nobody has a lot of experience.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And I think that is the perfect audience for today's session, because we are really going to do a lot of basic overview and really cover the basics pretty well. So that's awesome. So let me start by saying, in terms of what BIML is, it is a markup language. And so the most common markup language that we know of and use today is really HTML. And that's what you see on the screen in front of you right now. I'm sure all of you have seen it, somewhere in either your job or, studies or your personal life before. And BIML is really no different. Obviously, there's a few twists, but we'll definitely go through all of those. Now, a couple of things make a markup language what it is. And the first thing is that it consists of tags. So you would have all of these tags that would identify what you are trying to do or display, and the tags will, really form the actual commands or what's being interpreted, by the language engine at the end of the day. Something that is unique to a markup language too is the fact that it's human readable. So just by looking at the HTML code in front of you, it's pretty easy to see this is a title. It's going to show hello world. You can see that there's a body. And then obviously some things are a little more obfuscated or less easy to decipher what it means. And then, so in this case, P is really what denotes a paragraph. But for the most part, you can look at the tags. You can pretty much sort of see what it's trying to do just by looking at it. And then, of course, on top of that, what we have in a markup language too is the concept of a property. And as you can see from the highlighted text here, you have the option, to set different properties of that element. In this case, we're just going to set the color of the title to blue. And so, coming back to BIML, BIML is really just that. It's a markup language that allows us to specify what we are trying to do without specifying how to do it. And the language interpreter, or the compiler, if you would, at the end of the day, would look at all of these tags and say, okay, this is what it looks like this person's trying to do. And so if you look at the BIML code here, again, it starts with, simple BIML tag and ends with it. And then you can see there's the concept of packages and a package. And you can see that we also have the properties there. So we give this package a name and it's called load some data. Now let's talk a little bit about why we should use BIML, or at least why I think it's a good language to use in your everyday development. And to illustrate that, we're going to start with a little video, and I'm going to show you guys in SSIS today how many clicks it takes to change two simple properties. And so this is a pretty simple package. What it does, it truncates a table, and then the data flow task, which is the second one there, will essentially just reload that table with some data from a source system. And so very simple, very straightforward. And we're going to change two properties only. And those two properties are the rows per batch and the maximum insert commit size. Now, if you've used SSIS a lot, then you would know exactly what these are. If you don't, it doesn't really matter. We're just trying to really show you how laborious some of these really simple tasks could be in SSIS. And so we'll let this start and we'll run through. So there's 2 clicks just to open the data flow, another 2 to open the properties of the destination. And now we get to the actual properties themselves, and now we can change it from 50,000 to 10,000. Click OK. And of course we have to save it. So that's 8 clicks just to change 2 very small properties of a very, very simple package. Now let's take this one step further and let's look at what it would take to do the exact same thing in BIML. And so what I have in front of you now is a BIML script, and don't worry too much about the details of that. But it's a BIML script that does exactly the same thing as our SSIS package. In fact, I use this BIML script to generate that package. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to change those 2 properties. There's 1 click, 2 clicks, and of course we have to save. So that's 3 clicks versus the 8 before. And so that brings us to all of the different reasons that, that we should be using BIML. And obviously my first reason is ultimately you want to save your mouse. In my case, my sanity as well, because changing these properties are just very, very laborious in SSIS. Now, we've been dealing with a very simple package here and only one, but imagine a scenario where you have a pretty large project with hundreds of packages or tens of packages, and you have to change a single property in each one of those. To do that in the GUI in SSIS or the developer interface today will just take forever, and it's super laborious. A few other things that I want to highlight that makes really good reasons to use BIML is because of the fact that it's a scripting language or a markup language, we can enforce coding standards. So I can create a template, I can set certain things in place, for instance, the rows per batch. I can code that in there so that everybody starts out with the same thing. And everything, as long as everything's being generated from that template, then it will be pretty standard, and you can create the standards like that. Of course, you could do the same thing with an SSIS package, but doing it in something like a scripting language or a markup language, just makes it so much more obvious and makes it so much easier to change after the fact. The third reason why I like to use BIML is for source control purposes. Now, I don't know if any of you ever had a look behind the scenes of an SSIS package, but I can tell you that it's a pretty big mess. And it's a pretty big mess because as you go and create all of these elements from the visual interface, it would then go and generate the XML code that really makes up the SSIS package. That's all good for the most part, but what it doesn't do really well is ensure that the XML appears in the package in the same order. And so you get to the point where things are really messy and could change order quite frequently, and that makes source control really, really difficult. If you have something that's more structured, like I've shown you in the BIML script and will show you in some others, then it becomes much easier to have source control because everything has its place, and it's just better structured from that point of view. The last reason, of course, is automation, and I haven't showed you that yet, but at the end of this session, I'm going to show you guys how you can really ramp it up and use BIML to automate the creation of 90% of your packages, maybe even more depending on what you do. And so those are all very good reasons why I think you should use BIML and why I use BIML whenever I deal with SSIS development myself. So let's move on and look at a few basics in terms of BIML itself and the language. And for that, I'm going to go out of this screen. And before we get to the demo, there's a few things I want to show you guys. First is just BIML Express itself. So that's an add-on for Visual Studio that you will need if you're going to use BIML itself. And I've just gone to the website here. You can go to verigens.com/BIML Express and, download the BIML Express add-in, which will then, go through the installation. And I'll show you guys what that looks like in Visual Studio. What I also want to point out before we get started is they also have a website called BIMLscript.com, where they have walkthroughs of all of the basics and everything that you need to know about BIML. So if you like what you see today and you'd like to know more, this is a really good learning program to run through and get yourself educated on how to do everything. All right, with that being said, let's go back to Visual Studio. And this is the package we showed in the video before. I'll go through it quickly again. Simple package, truncates my product table, and then there's a data flow task. If I click through to that, you'll see that it pretty much just loads my product table from AdventureWorks. And so what I'm doing here is something that we do very typically in a data warehousing project, is we like to extract the data from a source system and then stage it in staging or temporary tables. And from that point forward, we will then transform it, before loading it into the final schema. And so that's essentially what this package will do. Now, I've already installed BIML here, so I'm not going to go through the installation process again. But what I can show you guys is how do you know that BIML is actually there and it's working? And the best way to have a look at that is if you right-click on a package, you will see two extra context items pop up in the menu. And the one that says add new BIML file, and obviously if you click on that, you can go add a new file, but it also gives you the ability to convert an existing package to BIML. And that's very useful if you're just starting out. So you may have some existing packages. You want to get a better idea of what it could look like using BIML. And once you've installed the add-in, you would be able to do that through this context menu. Okay, but what I want to show you guys is really the BIML side of it. So let's look at the BIML code that I used to generate this package. And we'll go through a few basic things that is present in this BIML code. I'm surely not going to teach you guys everything today, but we'll definitely work on showing you guys some of the basic things. As it is with any markup language like HTML, there's always a start tag, so to speak, and an end tag, for most elements. And in the case of BIML, it all starts with a BIML tag, and it points to, the schema definition that can be found on the Verigens site. I'll leave the top line out for now. We'll come back to that to explain a few other concepts. And so for this BIML script, I have a section for my connections. And you can see that I have all of my different connections there. Specify the connection strings. Pretty straightforward stuff. You can read that and make sense of that. Then we have a packages tag. And that's sort of a good indicator that we can use the same script file to generate multiple packages, even though we're just, generating one year. But that's sort of the structure of these BIML scripts. And you can see, so inside that you'll have the package tab. Inside of that you'll have tasks. Inside of that we'll have containers, and so on and so forth. And so you can see the part where I truncate the table is in that task over there. It's the execute SQL task. And then I also have the data flow task that then takes care of transferring all of the data from, from the source system. Pretty straightforward. There's nothing more I'm going to show you guys there. As we walk through it, it'll make a lot of sense. But the first thing that I do want to point out here is a couple of things. First is, let's go back to the top line. And in the top line is what's called a BIML directive. And the directive usually starts with the three little indicators in the beginning there that shows we're gonna add a directive here. So it's the less than sign and the hash, and then there's an @ sign, and that indicates that this is a directive and not just a standard code block. In this line, we are doing two things. We are setting the language, and in terms of language, we can use either C# or VB, and we're also specifying a tier, which we'll come back to, but it should be a good indicator to you that there is some form of hierarchical structure going on here when we're dealing with BIML. The next thing I want to point out is the connections at the top. Now you can imagine that if we had to do this for a bunch of different packages, then we're going to recreate a lot of code and have to copy and paste a lot of things. And so what's nice about BIML is we can use the hierarchical nature of it to reduce the amount of code that we have and the amount of rework or retyping that we need to do. And to show you how that works, I have another BIML script here, and this time what I have is only the connections. So I have the connections in here, and I have the tier indicated as a 1. And so you can see now we are starting to make use of the hierarchical nature of it, and we're going to create different levels of scripts that we can execute as a group, and that can do, certain things for us. So now I have my connections separated out, and I've gone and created another script file here that looks identical to the other one, but it doesn't have the connections. And with the hierarchical nature of it, I would now be able to use both of these together and generate the package. Now let's look at what that looks like. So first what I want to do is I want to just use our very first script and go and create our package. There's our package right there. It exists. Let's go and delete it. And I'm going to right click, say generate SSIS packages, and we'll give it a second. And what you'll see it'll do here, it's just going to give me a message that says you're going to create one new item, but you're going to override 2 other items. And the items that we're overriding right now is just the connection managers because they already exist in the package. So that's all good. And we'll click OK, and there's our SSIS package right there. Now let's try the same with the BIML script that does not contain the connections and see what happens. All right, so you can see there's an error. And the error is actually telling us that it doesn't like the fact that there's no connection, even though we are pointing to a connection. And so that's happening right here, where we're pointing to a connection with the name staging DB, but it's not in our script file. But now also, as I've just told you, we can use the hierarchical nature of BIML and create all of these different tiers of scripts. And because we've done that, we can highlight both of these items. We can right click it, and we can click generate packages, and now you'll see it'll work beautifully and it'll recreate that package. And the reason why it's working is it's able to compile everything in the first tier first, and because of that we can now point to that connection in the second tier, and it recognizes it because it's already there. So that's a really good use case and provides a really good platform for reuse and code reuse when we try and do these things. So we can literally have a BIML script for all of our connections, and only do that once, and then everything else, as long as we use it together, we could then avoid recreating or retyping a bunch of things. One other thing I want to show you guys is the concept of an include file. And so BIML also allows us to use include files. And what I've done here is I've created another connections file, but you guys can see the main difference here is I don't have start and end tags, BIML tags as I had in the others. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to use the concept of an include file to literally just inject all of this text into our other BIML script. And let me show you what that looks like. Hide the preview. And what we've done here is we've just added another directive that says include this file. And essentially when we compile this or generate the package, all it's going to do, it's going to grab the text from that file and inject it into our script here. And to prove that works, I can just right click on that, and it doesn't have connections in it, so in theory it should fail, but it doesn't because it literally just injected all of the text. And I can also show you how I did that by opening up the preview, and you can see that all of our connections are there. I'll blow that up. All right, so a couple of really useful things we can do with BIML. Let's take that one step further. BIML also has something called a root node. And essentially what that is, it's really just tapping into the object model of SSIS projects. And the way that you would refer to something or point to something as part of that object model is by using a little code block, and you can see how it's denoted there, and then saying a root node dot and whatever that property is. So in this case, we're pointing to an existing connection within our project. So the staging DB connection already exists, and by the fact that it already exists, we can now use the object model here to point to that actual connection, and we don't have to store it everywhere else. Now, to be honest with you guys, I don't use that a ton, but it is very useful in certain cases. For instance, some folks use it to connect to, project parameters and reuse certain things that's on a project level. So very useful in terms of reusing certain things and really tapping into the overall model that SSIS projects consist of. Definitely something that you can read about a little bit further if that's something that you're interested in. Okay, so now we've shown a couple of basic things, but let's take this one step further. And to show you guys what we can do is I've just set up a little demo here. And please, this is not necessarily the way you should do it or even the way that I do it, but I wanted to show you guys an example of how we can use this in combination with C# code to really bump it up to the next level in terms of package generation. And so what I've done here is I've used the BIML script and I've added a code block, and that's the code block over there. And in this code block, I'm doing a few things. I am setting some parameters. I am creating an array. You can see it's just a simple array with product category, and subcategory. And then I set some query strings really, and I assign those to variables. And so because of that, what I can now do in my BIML script is I can build a very simple loop that really loops over the items of my array, and I can go and generate all of these packages based on that. And I'm not going to explain all the code necessarily here, but as you can see, it's really just making use of a combination of C# code, which we can inject with the code block, or we're referencing an actual variable, which we can do like it's done there with the code block, but then there's an equals to sign in the beginning. So that points directly to a value that you're going to inject into that property over there. And so with that being said, if I now go and right click on this guy and say generate all, see what it does. Oh, it's complaining because I need my connections. So let's do that. And you'll see that it's just telling me it's going to regenerate all of these different connections. And I say yes. And now we've generated all 3 of my SSIS packages essentially in a couple of seconds by using some scripts and some code. And so that's really where we want to get to at the end of the day. That's really the crux of all of this, is the fact that you can reuse a bunch of code and create some procedural code in order to generate these packages for you. All right, let me pause there for a second. Mikhail, let me know if there are any questions that we can look at now before I go back to the presentation.
Yes, we have a question from Haida. That is, could you take an SSIS from an old project, 2014, BIML it and insert it to a new project, for instance, 2019? Are there a lot of adjustments that needs to be made?
Yes, the short answer is yes. And I'll preface that with, if you want to generate the BIML script from the package, you would need a BIML Express version, that's going to work. And so if you have 2014, I know that there is a legacy 2010 or a Visual Studio 2010 version available that I think would work with that package. So that's if you want to sort of, generate it, from an existing package. With that being said, as long as the BIML script that it is that you want to create and you have the right version of, of Visual Studio, it's all dependent on the version that you set in that project, and that'll be the version that, that it will generate, which from 2015 onwards shouldn't be different.
Perfect.
Hope that helps, but let us know if we didn't answer that correctly. One more, if there's one more, Mikhail, otherwise we'll carry on.
You have one, Mark.
So is there any way that we can use BIML to develop Azure Data Factory pipelines? And if not, do you think that Variagents may eventually provide support for the cloud?
Oh, that's a great question. I want to answer that at the end, if you don't mind, because
Sure.
I think it's going to open Pandora's box. And I'll potentially get myself into trouble, in which case we need to edit it out.
Okay.
All right, cool. I'm going to continue here. Sorry, this break was literally so I could get a glass of water. So now that that's done, let's continue with the rest of the presentation. We'll get to the other questions in a little bit. Okay, so with everything that I've shown you guys so far in BIML, I think we all will get to the same conclusion. And the conclusion is that, okay, this seems like a really great tool or language to use and build a framework. And you would be 100% correct if that was your conclusion, that in fact, that's everybody's conclusion. And, so people would typically, if you go out there and you go search for, an ETL framework using BIML, this is what you would typically find in such a framework. Most of these frameworks will connect to a data source, so some kind of a source database somewhere. They will extract all of the metadata, so tables, fields, etc. And they will then use BIML to generate staging packages from the metadata. Now that makes sense for the most part. But when I started reading all the really great blog posts out there and the stuff from Variagents themselves in terms of how to do this, I realized that I'm not really like most people. And I'm not like most people because I want things in a little bit of a different way. So I don't typically, in the development that I do, I don't want all of the source tables. So I don't want to just blindly connect to a data source, return all of the tables and all of the attributes, and then bring all of that into a staging area. I want to pick and choose what tables I want to bring in, and I want to pick and choose what attributes I bring. In addition to that, I also deal with some source systems where the data types are not directly translatable to SSIS or SQL Server at least. And so when I deal with those, I may need to change the data type on the fly, and that sort of breaks the chain of that generic framework, because I can't just use, the data source that I have and its data types that already has established. And so when I looked at that, I thought to myself, okay, but I don't think I'm that different. I think most people would want that, but the question is, how do we do that? How do we account for, the fact that we don't want all the source tables, don't want all the source attributes, and the fact that we may want to change the data types as we bring all of this in. And so that prompted me to, in my journey at least, prompted me to look a little bit closer in terms of my own process and what I do. And so let me take you through my typical ETL development process. And maybe that'll resonate with you, because that's sort of the logical, conversation I had to have with myself. So at my own process, at a little more granular level, this is typically what I would do. First, I would identify all the source systems. Then I would identify all the source attributes that I need to bring in. Then I'll create my staging tables. Then I'll develop all my staging SSIS packages. So this is a typical data warehouse project for me. And then I get to the next step. And that next step's usually, oh boy, I forgot something. Or somebody came to me and said, we need that one other table or that one other attribute. And so what do we do at this point? Well, we go back to step 2. That happens about 10 times at least. If you're me, probably more than that, but let's say 10 times. Let's take this one step further. If we look at the broader process, let's get to step 24, where we're developing our fact table procedures. And that's sort of part of my process, because I stage the data first, and then I would use stored procedures, to transform the data before I load dimensions and fact tables. But at that point, at step 25 or 24, if I realize that I forgot something, what do I have to do? Well, I have to go back to step 2. And again, if you're me, I'm not talking to you folks, if you're me, that probably happens about 20 times. Or even worse, let's get to step 104, and maybe for you it's step 200. And we've now developed a great new report. All of our dimension fact tables are done. It's all populated. We show the brand new report to the end user. What happens next? Oh, the user wants another measure. Okay. Okay, maybe not okay. So I need another source attribute. So what do? We go back to step 2. And if you are like me, that happens at least 100 times. At that point in time, I feel like this little guy over here. And that part of the job I hate, because there's so much back and forth in this process, and there's so much work and rework, that it really just becomes a laborious mess. And so for me, in a perfect world, apart from playing golf every single day, in a perfect world, I want this framework to do a few other things for me. I want it to script my tables, so I don't have to go and continuously create and recreate tables in a manual fashion, or continuously re-script everything. I wanted to create my staging tables for me, or generate them for me. And the reason I care mostly about the staging packages is that's where most of the generic stuff happens, the recreatable logic, the stuff that can be automated. That's where most of that happens, and that's also where most of the really mind-numbing, laborious changes will have to come if things change. Obviously it's not that simple to do this with other packages that are just one-offs, but staging packages usually all have a very, very similar pattern that they follow, and so they are really good candidates for this kind of automation. And so I want my framework to be able to do that. I also want my framework to generate parent packages. So typically I would create really granular child packages that would take one table at a time and extract one table and populate one staging table. And then I want something that's one level up that could group that together, maybe a package that takes a subset of those tables and bring them all in. And maybe it's based on an area of the business, or maybe it's just based on the source. But I want this framework to be able to generate all of those packages for me in a consistent way. At the same time, I want to reduce the impact and the risk of making changes. So I don't want to get into the situation where I have to make a change to 100 different packages, but because it's so much and it's so difficult to keep track, I miss one, or I make the wrong change in a few of those packages. And so I want a framework that'll help me reduce that risk and impact. Also want something to help me speed up development. You know, I don't want to go back and forth 100 times. I want something to make that much simpler. And ultimately, I want something that helps me with documentation. That will be the cherry on the cake for me. If I can get something that helps me do all of this stuff and help me with documentation, that's a go for me. And as I thought through all of these things and thought through my own process and, you know, what I wanted to get out of this, suddenly I had a light bulb moment and it all started making sense. And it really all began with a document we typically do as part of a data warehouse project called the source to target mapping document. And let me show you guys what that looks like and show you guys the process that I followed to work through all of that. Okay, so here is what typically is a source to target mapping document. And now obviously what I'm showing you guys here is my adapted version of that for what I'm trying to do with my framework. But I'll quickly just go through and explain, you know, what a source to target mapping really is. But it's nothing more than just documenting every single source attribute that you're extracting from every single source system. And then sometimes you would use the document to indicate a lineage, if that's possible. If it's not, it's really just used to contain the metadata for everything that you do. And so Excel is a good candidate for that because it's typically a bunch of metadata columns and rows. Not to say that you couldn't use something like a table in a database somewhere to do all of this stuff, but Excel, you know, for obvious reasons, is easy to administrate and to update and to distribute as a document. Now, typically in my world, what happens is this document would be the last thing that you do, and it's super laborious because you can imagine now that you've done everything, you have to go back and you have to go document every single attribute that, you know, from every single source system and every single destination table, and it's quite a big job. And so part of the light bulb moment that I had is, what if I could use this source to target mapping document as the source for my framework? And how can I adapt it to then use ultimately as the input for what I need to do here and to generate all of these packages? And if I can do that, then that is sort of a double whammy. You know, I kill the proverbial two birds with one stone, and I can do both of those things. I can do the document at the same time as I'm actually doing development, even though I'm not physically writing code. And so that brought me to this adapted version of the source to target mapping document. And I'm going to go through that fairly quickly, and then I'll show you guys how I utilize that in conjunction with BIML to do everything that I need to do. So I've got a couple of tabs here. The first is data sources. This is typically just where I would document every single data source that I have. Pretty straightforward. I have a role, I have a label, a type, usually a connection string because I can use that. And then I've built in a few other flags, if you would, or attributes that, you know, that I could use in my framework to help make things easier. So for instance, I can indicate whether I want objects from the source to be scripted or not, because typically you want to create staging tables, but you don't want to recreate source tables necessarily. And then also a load sequence in case, you know, I have multiple sources. Then I take that one step deeper in the next tab and I document, you know, all of my source tables and files. And so here you can see I have schemas, I have table names and files, I have aliases, but mainly I use this to incorporate some filters into my source queries. Now, obviously a best practice would be to only extract the data that you need. And so when it comes to data warehousing, you know, a lot of times that will be date-based. And so what I did here is I built in the ability to have a filter on these source queries, and even have that point to variables that I will have in my SSIS packages, so I can restrict the data that comes in. Other than that, I wanted to go one step further and have the ability to either use the filter or not. Sometimes during development, you may just want to recreate this package quickly with no filter in place, so you can import all of the source data and test it out, test out performance, for instance. I also wanted the ability to say whether I want to recreate the staging package when I run this script in this framework, and also whether I want to include it in the parent package. And so I built all of these things in here. That's obviously things that you wouldn't necessarily see in a typical source to target mapping document, but I did for the sake of my framework. The next worksheet here lists every single attribute in every single source table that I have. And so you can see that if I scroll across here, I have all of the attributes. Ordinal position helps me, just order it. So I have the same order in the source as I have in the staging database. And then I have source data types and target data types. This really helps me out in the cases where I'm dealing with something that's not directly translatable to SQL Server types, or in cases where I may want to change it. So as you can see on the one line here, I have product line as an NCAR2, but you know what? I don't really care about saving it as such. I would rather want to make it a varchar5. And so this allows me to build that into these staging packages to do that on the fly. And then a couple of other interesting things like, I like to indicate if something is a business key or not, and that helps with the documentation aspect of it. So going through the rest of all of this, then I have a tab for all my staging tables. So again, listing every staging table, every attribute, every data type. I think the most obvious thing that I need to point out here is typically my staging process, I would call things exactly what they are called in the source, right? So they map one-to-one with the actual source, and I would do things for special characters, like if there's a space, then I'll just replace that with an underscore. But all these things I can recreate or generate rules with, and as long as I have the same naming convention in my staging database as I get from the source, then it all becomes super easy, and SSIS can do that mapping pretty easily. So a couple of other things there: data types, business keys, whether I want it to be nullable or not, and again, a load sequence to help me out. You can also see that I add certain other things. So if I highlight that line for you there, I just add a date on which I inserted the row, so I can get a little bit more information out of that. And then if I scroll down here, when it comes to fact tables and things like that, you would usually want to build in a bunch of other additional things into that, and I don't have that here. I don't, but you would want to build in additional fields. Maybe you want to do some lookups and persist some other attributes or derive some other attributes, and you would just add all of those in here. But then to get back to my framework, what I then did was I created a series of BIML scripts. And the one I want to show you guys first is one that essentially just goes out to that workbook. And you can see in the highlighted section there is where I point to that Excel workbook. And it goes to my staging tables worksheet. And I'm not going to explain all the code here, but it literally just iterates all of that and then generates the create table scripts for me. So what I could typically do is I could just come in here, I can run this BIML script, or even just look at the preview, and you can see that it's created the drop and create table script for each of those. And the beauty of all of that is if I wanted to go change something now, so let's say, for instance, product number needs to change from, a varchar 50 to a varchar 500, what I would do then is I would simply go to my Excel workbook, and I will go to product number. Let's add a 0. I apologize if you can't see that if it's too small. I would save my workbook and I would come in here and update my preview. And as you can see immediately, I have a new create table script and I can literally just copy paste this into something like Management Studio and recreate my staging table. Of course, you could even take this one step further and actually execute that query to recreate it. For me, I want to be a little safer than that. So I choose to rather just generate the script and then, I can pick and choose how I want to execute it. But that's sort of the value of a framework like this. Not to say that you should be using BIML necessarily to generate table scripts, but it provided a really good platform for me to do something like that. Let's take this one step further. Let me show you guys the script I have that generates all of my child packages. So again, what we're doing here is connecting to that source to target mapping document, and the rest is really just, just code. And it's really just iterating the rows and the columns of the Excel workbook to then create these packages for me. Okay, so in this script, now I can really set my standards in terms of the naming conventions and everything that I want. You can see that typically what I would do for the name of a package is it would be that, which is really just the label of the data source with an underscore, and then I concatenate the actual name of the source table and file. And so all of that just becomes procedural code. And so now we're just playing with syntax and we're playing with code, and we're doing some nice things. But ultimately, when all this is said and done, you can see that in about 200 lines of code, I've now created a process that will iterate everything I have in Excel and will generate all of the packages for me. And so if I show you the preview, you'll see the end result of all of that. And here we go. Here are all my packages, and you can see everything that it's doing over there. And now what you can see here is a product number here. It's selecting that out of the source. It's still a varchar 50. So let's go back and change that to be consistent with what we wanted to do in our staging area. So I'll go here and we'll go to product number, change that to 500, save the document, and we'll just update this guy over here. And now you can see we're converting it to varchar 500. And so the beauty of all of this is, once I make my change, the 200 changes I get as part of a general process of developing this kind of a process. Whenever there's a change, I go to Excel, I make the change in Excel, and it's as simple as coming back in here and saying, let's regenerate all of those packages. I know it's consistent with what I'm doing in Excel, and I can say commit, and there's all my packages. If another change comes in, I make a change in Excel, I regenerate my packages, they're all there. And then I also took it one step further and created another script that'll then create parent packages based on whatever I have there. And so you can see what I'm doing here is I'm actually enforcing the load sequence based on what I have in Excel. And so when this is all said and done, let's quickly generate this guy and I'll show you what that looks like. I'll give that a second. Okay, there it's done. So what it did here is it created this package, which is a top level package. And that now encompasses all of the other packages based on the load sequence that I had in my Excel workbook. And so I know that's a bunch of stuff that I've just covered there, but primarily I want to show you guys the real power of using something like BIML and a markup language is the sense that you can really create a repeatable process and something that could be used to generate all of these packages for you. If there is a process that can be repeatable, and you can even take it one step further and be a little creative and combine it with something like a source to target mapping document, help take care of your documentation at the same time and avoid all of the laborious back and forth, code changes you need to make. That's pretty much my story. I'm going to stop right there and let's see if we have any questions.
We have a bunch of questions. So even if we do singular packages, like this first example, the standalone package, would it be a best practice to always do the packages as tier 2 to account for connections and globals in a later stage?
Yes, great question. And the answer to that is yes. I would definitely recommend doing that. I know, in fact, I know some people, what they would do is they would actually start at number 100 or number 99 or 102 or, whatever that number is, so they can always fit something in before that if they want to. So yes, great idea. If you are going to start off with BIML, and even if you are going to create individual BIML scripts for individual packages, maybe start at level 10, tier 10. I mean, those numbers could go up, I think, until, 265,000. So you have a lot to play with there.
Cool. So next question. When using source control to manage your BIML code, isn't code comparison slightly difficult to do when comparing XML script, i.e. is it a similar experience to comparing Power BI code, or is it easier in practice?
It's definitely easier because there's more structure to it, right? The structure is always going to be the same in your BIML script, and it's not going to change as the back end of the SSIS package would look like. I'll take this one step further. In theory, if you have something like this that could regenerate all of your SSIS packages, you could remove source control from the packages themselves and only source control the BIML script itself.
So I noticed that you had the do not save sensitive in the package. So where do we save sensitive? Where do we have the secure credentials, the passwords? Can we have Key Vault from Azure, or do you have some do-it-all-fits-all solution?
Yeah, good question. So typically what I like to do is a number of different things. So when it comes to Azure, yes, definitely use Key Vault. In SSIS, try to use Windows authentication as much as you possibly can. And that could be established with a proxy in SQL Server 2. So, so that you don't have to hard code passwords into these packages. At times, I will admit that I've actually put the passwords in the actual connection strings, and that's why I have connection strings in my Excel doc. It's not super secure that way, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but it does beat the alternative.
Are there any tools, or should I say, are there any other tools I can use to develop BIML scripts beyond Visual Studio and BIML Express? I.e., is there a snap-in for VS Code or Azure Data Studio or anything else you can think of?
At this point in time, I don't know of anything outside of Visual Studio. I know that Verigens themselves sell a few other products, and those products are development environments within themselves, right? So they would essentially also generate SSIS packages, but the environment looks different, and you wouldn't be doing it inside Visual Studio anymore. As far as BIML script is concerned, or BIML Express at least, the only platform is Visual Studio.
Okay, cool. And I expect if there is something in VS Code, a simple search in the add-ins would bring that up, wouldn't it?
There might be, although I wouldn't bank on it being compatible with VS Code.
Right, okay.
Okay, we have a final question, and that is, does BIML script allow the use of reusable code concepts, such as procedures, modules, or functions?
Yes, it does. Great question. So you could literally have some BIML script files that contains all of those functions and then just call them. And again, as long as your tiers are set correctly, then it would compile one before the other, and you would be able to do that. Yeah, for sure.
Nice.
So Mikhail lied a little bit saying it was the last question, but we do have that super secret question that you're trying to dodge. So given we still have lots of people waiting who we're going to have to put under an NDA, are you able to tell us anything? So let me just repeat that question one more time. Please. Is there any way we can use BIML to develop Azure Data Factory pipelines? And if not, do you think Verigens might eventually provide support for the cloud?
Yes, that is a loaded question. I'm gonna be super honest with you guys. And so again, don't take me to the cleaners about this, but right now, if you look at BIML script, I'm actually using it today to generate, my create table script. So if it can be used to generate text, which is what I've done with the create table scripts, you could really use it to generate anything. And ADF is really just JSON code behind the scenes. So you could certainly use BIML Express to generate that. Would it be super convenient? Probably not, because you would have to try and do it in Visual Studio and then sort of take some of the text out, and copy and paste it into ADF, which wouldn't be wouldn't be super great from a usability standpoint, but not impossible. BIML have products for the cloud, so they're paid products. I think it's called BIML Studio, and they've got one other, will actually generate ADF pipelines and ADF components for you, but at that point it's not free anymore. In fact, and this is the brutally honest part, I know myself and a bunch of other people in the community have some concerns over the fact that BIML Express has not really evolved in the last couple of years. It seems like they developed the community version of the product and sort of left it there, and it hasn't changed in the last few years. I'm hoping with the new version of SQL Server that comes out, at least they will provide an update to that, but I'm not 100% sure on the longevity of it for the future to come. With that being said, I don't think it's going to go away tomorrow or the next, but I wouldn't necessarily bank on them bringing a community version out for the ADF, for instance. One other thing I could add to that, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but I am actually busy right now building my own version of a similar framework that will generate ADF components, and hope to be in a good position maybe sometime next year when I, where I can at least make that available or start sharing that. Yeah, that's
so Martin, how do I buy shares in your brand new component then?
You cannot buy shares in it. It's what I've shown you guys today will be available in GitHub, and you guys can go download and play around with it. I'm hoping to make the ADF version, at least the base version, available on a similar basis for sure.
Cool.
I think that was the perfect ending question, and I say thanks for everybody who joined us, and a big thanks to Martin.
Good deal. Yeah, thank you, folks. Thank you for listening, and hit me up on Twitter if you guys have any questions. I'd be happy to help.